The Justice Beat is dedicated to the 1 in 3 Americans touched by incarceration. The Justice Beat is where we discuss all things justice.
Today's topic, Cannabis Reform, Fighting Criminal Injustice. Mikelina Belaineh. Mikelina has spent their career exploring how to facilitate community regeneration and empowerment in marginalized communities. Their work has focused on examining the desperate impact of the criminal legal on Black and Brown communities and working with various stakeholders, impacted community advocates, government decision makers, and experts to explore innovative solutions. Mikelina has worked as a chief program officer for a community-based social enterprise working to address the root cause of street and gang violence, a contributor to the field and literature of criminal justice reform, and an expert consultant of local governments interested in implementing alternatives to incarceration.
Well, good morning, Justice Beat family and our family on Real STL News. Welcome back again to another episode of the Justice Beat Talk Show. Today, we will be discussing cannabis and the injustices of the new marketplace. Today, our guest speaker is Mickey. Mickey, good morning.
Good morning. How's it going?
Pretty good. Glad to have you with us.
I'm happy to be here.
All right, I know it's early. What time is it for you?
I mean, it's not that early. It's like 11 here.
Oh,
so I've been
okay.
up. I've been up for a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, you're on the East Coast.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Well, good. All right. Well, we're glad to have you, and I'm glad we had an opportunity to connect on yesterday and talk over a few things and get to know each other a little bit. So today we're talking about cannabis and the new marketplace and several other things we're going to talk about. And I'm sure a lot of people are really eager to hear the discussion around this new marketplace and industry around cannabis, and thinking about the numbers of people that are sitting in jails and prisons behind these arrests and incarcerations because of the possession and or use of marijuana. So we're going to get into a lot of things, but first off, Mickey, I want you to kind of talk to us a little bit about how did you get into this particular industry, in particular, beginning with the Last Prisoner Project.
For sure. So yeah, to introduce like kind of, I guess, who I'm stepping into the space as. So I'm coming as organizationally, like I work for the Last Prisoner Project as the director for criminal justice. And the Last Prisoner Project is an organization that works at the intersection of criminal justice advocacy and cannabis reform. So specifically, our populations that we serve are folks who have been negatively impacted by the criminalization of cannabis, along like as part of the larger impact of the war on drugs. But to talk about like how I got into this space, I'm a little bit of an outlier in the cannabis reform space in that I actually come from a more traditional criminal justice background. So I'm a lawyer, graduated Harvard Law 2016, took the bar in Massachusetts, but chose to not practice. So I wanted to do criminal justice work, but I wasn't satisfied with the options that were presented to me, because I was like, you could either be a public defender or a staff attorney at a nonprofit and practice in that way. But I really went to law school because I was curious about the law, what it means, and then ultimately how we could change it, right? How we could change the way things are. So long story short, I co-founded and helped build out a street and gang violence reduction program in Boston called Inner City Weightlifting. And basically I did street and gang violence, like youth advocacy work there. Just, a lot of my work was like picking guys up, driving them around, helping them get licenses, taking them to court. We had an internship work development program that was sort of, our whole mission was to give guys a positive alternative to the streets, because we recognized that, these guys, they were the 1% of young folks who drove 60 to 70% of the violence in the city. But our whole model and theory of change was that you know, these guys aren't just bad decision makers as the government and courts would kind of, you know, lead people to believe. Like our whole theory is like, you can't be a good decision maker if you only have bad options. Like all of our guys were born in like 10,000 or less like income households, you know, born to parents who were negatively impacted by the crack epidemic, by the war on drugs. And that shit, sorry, excuse my language, but that hit heavy in Boston specifically. It's like the birthplace of the opioid epidemic as well. Anyway, so like I got proximate to the problem. Like in law school, we talked a lot about the laws and how it operates and whatnot, but we never really talked about real life. And so I was left with a gap in my education, which is why I chose the route that I did. And so from there, you know, I did that, and we can talk more about my experience there if you'd like, but to talk about kind of my trajectory to the Last Prisoner Project, you know, I spent a few years doing that work on the ground. And while I felt like I got a whole new perspective, a whole new education in terms of what the impacts of mass incarceration really meant, right, for real life living people and impacted populations, I was left with the question of how do we actually change the systems? Because like we had guys we worked with that, you know, we got them to making like $90,000 as personal trainers. Like they were out of the streets, you know, they had a steady job, steady, legit income. They were doing everything right. And still like the system would have ways of kind of pulling them back in. And it would be like, you know, so it was like, even when people change, the systems don't change. And therefore sometimes outcomes for people don't change. And so I got curious about that, which led me to leave kind of the grassroots world and go to the Bureau Institute of Justice to do policy research. So my work there was I worked like with local jail, or not local jails, but with local governments to try and reduce their jail population. So it's like governments would be like, we can't afford this incarceration problem and we don't want to continue to invest in incarceration, but we don't know how to do that. So us and like a team of other like quantitative, qualitative researchers would like go in and do like data work and try and evaluate like what are driving your jail admissions, what is keeping people in jail for X amount of time, et cetera, and basically doing like a root cause analysis and coming up with evidence-based solutions to implement alternatives to incarceration. So I wanted to see the inside of the system. I wanted to see like what is this machinery actually made up of, so that I could understand like where there are opportunities to change. Like what does this actually look like? And I learned a lot, but it was tiring work because I was consistently working with judges and DAs who were the same folks that were telling me that my guys in my community that I loved in the streets were just unworthy folks who deserved to be locked up. Like often these weren't bad people, the DAs and judges that I was interacting with, but they were still fully bought into the old myths of what got us here to mass incarceration, which is like Black and brown people basically are deserving of the circumstances they're in, right? Like they are in the circumstances they are in because of their disposition, because of their character, as opposed to recognizing that people are just dealt like a lottery, various circumstances, and like this is just a product of circumstance, not human disposition.
Right.
And so I felt like I was in the belly of the beast, right? Like trying to dismantle the system from within, but you know, like you're there, right? And so, and that takes a whole other kind of toll. And you know, I did street and gang work, and that's a lot of trauma there. But to be honest, my time at Bera was a tough go, like working within government. But long story short, I spent a couple of years doing that work, and I felt like I got a really good understanding of what the system looks like on the inside, like how government stakeholders are talking about this amongst themselves. Because I got to be inside those rooms. And eventually I felt like I got what I needed, and was like, all right, I'm going back on the outside to take this knowledge to the advocacy space and like find other folks that like, you know, take my knowledge and what I've learned and put it together with what other people have to learn. And let's see if we can come up with more innovative ways to like make things change. Because the way we've been doing it just is not working. What got me to the Last Prisoner Project specifically is that in both my experiences doing street and gang work, working with primarily like who would be called quote unquote violent offenders, and I have issues with that term, but that's what they're referred to as, right? The people that are often like, you know, considered the worst of the worst, right? So I went from that world to dealing with like local jails and government, and the one thing that continued to pop up as like a driver of incarceration was cannabis and like low level nonviolent drug offenses. And it was like, what was interesting was that it it doesn't look the same way it did like in the days of stop and frisks. A lot of people would think that like, oh, we don't arrest for cannabis anymore. We don't do this anymore, whatever. It's a battle like that's over. And yet, like the way it looked when I was at ICW is, these guys are identified. They're on lists, right? They're considered street gang involved, whatever. They've got like targets on their back for the police and the government already because they have decided that these are bad dudes, right? And so the system operates like this. You're identified, like you've done time, you have a record, you're on, you're on a list somewhere. If you're on probation or parole, a standard condition of probation or parole is like you can't use cannabis, even if you're in a state like Massachusetts where it's legal. And so imagine if you're a guy that's doing everything right, but the government has decided that you're not really, it's just a matter of time before you slip up. Cannabis becomes a very convenient excuse to arrest, intervene. That can result in a probation violation. If you get enough of those, you can be reincarcerated for something that you would never have been able to be incarcerated for if you were a civilian, if you were somebody who doesn't have a criminal record. And mind you, like criminal records look very different, but that's 70 million Americans we're talking about that have a criminal record. That's 1 in 3. And that's primarily disparately impacting Black and brown folks.
Right.
So that's kind of how it can operate in one way. And then when I was in actually looking and studying local government, like jail populations, again, there was a number like non-violent, low-level drug offenses are the things that were like people don't stay in jail for as long as they stay in prison, but we have like 10 million jail admissions a year, which is like exponentially more than the number of prison admissions we have. So it's like on any given day, you have more people sitting for longer in prison, but more people in this country will touch a local jail. And that actually like, the more jail interaction you have, you will inevitably eventually end up in prison because of the collateral consequences. So cannabis is often like the thing that can end up putting somebody in jail, right? And so it's like, it's the hook. It may not be the thing that leads to the conviction, but very often it can either be pretext for a criminal offense, like I smelled weed, so I searched the car and I found this, or it can be an excuse of sorts, which is I think you did something, I can get you caught up with the cannabis and then we'll find what we're looking for later. And then sometimes it's just that we're living in a world where if you're in a state where it's not legalized or decriminalized, you're still dealing with old like war on drugs type of policies. But I'm rambling, I'm going on a tangent a bit, but the whole takeaway is that on the ground and in the system, I saw cannabis as a thing that was a major contributor to mass incarceration, though it was operating in some very invisible ways. The ACLU put out a really great report recently, like we're in the era of legalization, but Black people are still 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis, despite the fact that we know there's equal usage among races, if not more, tipping in the opposite direction. Additionally, we know that we still, like in our most recent, like good data sets, we know that the police are still arresting more for cannabis than they are for all violent offenses combined. And cannabis arrests also outpace arrests for all other drugs. Additionally, almost like it's like 90+% of these cannabis arrests are for possession. So it's like we're in the era of legalization. People are making billions of dollars off this. And yet Black people are still consistently being pulled into the system for cannabis. Like police are still intervening and arresting for cannabis. And so it's like, the ACLU report was called The Tale of Two Countries, because that's really what it is right now. It's a gold rush or a green rush for, to be honest, white middle upper class and white corporate America. But we are still perpetuating intergenerational trauma for Black and brown folks and utilizing and cannabis is the tool. So it's like, yo, what's that about? So that's why I'm here. That's why I came to Last Prisoner Project, because I believe that a world where like full legalization, a world where police cannot intervene, approach, can't talk to nobody for cannabis, like cannabis can't be like the reason. That's a world where Black and brown folks are more free. Like cannabis is still the #1 tool for police to arrest. We take that tool away. We take that totally outside of the criminal legal realm. And we have made it will be a huge step in the right direction towards liberation for Black and brown folks. It's not the only thing that needs to happen, but it's a big tentacle of mass incarceration that's still alive and well, and we have the opportunity to just cut it off if we do legalization properly.
So how do we, where's the disconnect? We're in an era now where we've got new marketplaces springing up with cannabis shops, etc., but yet we still have this disparity around the Black and brown communities. What do we need to do as a people, folks on the ground, to level this out? What can we do strategically?
So, I mean, there's no one thing, right? It's a multifaceted approach because there's a number of barriers right now. Like because I think the vision or the goal would be like there's this whole new industry, $1 billion like growing industry. We want to talk about reparations. Like that's money, right? That's money right there. That's like the pie is growing, and why can't we take this growing pie and like just directly invest that and sort of leverage that for the empowerment and healing of Black and brown communities. So that's the idea, and that's why everybody's so excited, right? And I think that's why you see like a lot of corporate social responsibility initiatives and talk in the cannabis space right now. And that's all good and well, but the thing is like where like you can't like build a really nice house on really messed up foundation. Like we are pre-cannabis boom, right? Black and brown folks are like are barred from accessing capital, credit lines, housing. Like we're still dealing with the impacts of war on drugs. We're still dealing with the evolved practices of the war on drugs in such a way that like, how do I say this? It's like, yeah, there's a whole lot of opportunity there, but most Black and brown folks have like hard barriers from even accessing that. So take into consideration, 1 in 3 Americans have like a criminal record. We know the disparate impacts of rates of arrest and incarceration on Black and brown folks. If you have a criminal record, and if it's like a drug related criminal record, there's a number of like federal laws, state laws, local laws, depending on where you are. There's tons and tons of laws that just basically say like will literally prevent you from being able to work in the cannabis industry. So first off, it's like if you're not even legally allowed to access these opportunities, it's a non-starter for most Black folks, right? Black and brown folks or impacted folks. So what you have is like an industry that's saying, how do I say this? It's like there's no way for us to access or to cash in. A lot of, I think, governments and a lot of states that have legalized specifically, right? You're talking about the legalized industry, have looked to social equity programs as the answer. They're like, okay, cool. Like what we'll do is it's legal now. You can, and we're going to dedicate like, I don't know, we'll take X% of social equity applicants or X amount of like licenses that are granted will be social equity applicants. So let's say, first off, the number of people that are served by that are very small. It's a drop in the bucket in terms of like entire communities were ravished by war on drugs. And your solution to healing is by offering like a lotto ticket to a handful of folks, right? So the one that's like just short-sighted and I think lazy in terms of like what actually like community reinvestment looks like. But additionally, it's like the social equity programs often fall short because like running a business is expensive and takes a whole lot more than just the opportunity to apply. Like, and what we see very often is that of the social equity applicants that get licenses, they often end up like either being forced to sell out to larger operations down the line, or they don't last because they're still dealing with the implications of the criminalization of cannabis and drugs from the past that have prevented them from being able to access like the cash they need, operating costs, all that stuff. So it's like social equity programs just are ill-informed because I think a lot of these laws have been drafted not by people who have been impacted, but by decision makers that don't know what it's like to be like impacted by the war on drugs or to be impacted by a criminal record or to grow up in poverty, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of one thing. But I guess the thing that's really worth mentioning is the lack of consideration of retroactive relief. Okay. So think about it like this. If you got caught up in, you know, the height of the war on drugs in the 90s, early 2000s, pre-legalization, height of mass incarceration, you serve an 8-year, 10-year bid for something that is now legal, right? The implications, like the collateral consequences of serving any time in prison, let alone an 8 to 10-year bid, the impact that has on your life makes it such that like people who are system impacted or who have like been, you know, impacted by mass incarceration, your like unemployment rates are crazy. Your likelihood of being able to get housing is crazy, like homelessness, substance use disorder, et cetera, et cetera. Like we have already borne the brunt, like they've already been punished. And now it's like I kind of got off on a tangent. What I wanted to get to is like the criminal record is still there at the end of the day. And
but so is there any movement afoot, Mickey? Is there any movement afoot, like in some areas where they talk about expungement and you talk about being retroactive? What about expungement of those records?
Right. So that's what I wanted to get to. Like when you legalize, if you don't incorporate an expungement, or that's what I talk about with retroactive relief, because different places call it different things, but essentially it's like what you were criminalized and served time for before is now legal. And so what you need to do is like go back, and everybody that served time for that, you need to wipe their records clear, because they couldn't be arrested and served time for something that they already did, or that happened in the past, or that they were criminalized for in the past. But there's a number of problems with the way like we've seen it done, in that expungement needs to be automatic. So often, like if states don't make it automatic, the burdens of like doing expungement yourself, where the onus is like on the individual, very often it doesn't happen. Like the data shows that whenever, like let's say you do a petition process or something, like where the individual who has been impacted has to like file on their own behalf, put together application, whatever. Like there's a number of barriers to them being able to do that as well. And often it includes money. Like you have to like pay money to just get your criminal records. So what we really need to be doing is the onus should be on the government, right? Like the government should be saying like, my bad. So the onus should be on them to go and clear somebody's record, right? If you legalize, it's upon you to go and like see who all has been negatively impacted by misinformed, misguided, racially biased policies in the past, and like go clean that up. And so that's step one. Like best practice is, if you're going to legalize, you need to have a retroactive relief policy or mechanism in there, and you need to make it automatic. But even then, I'll have to say, like, the fight's still not done. Like a lot of people look to California, for example, as like a golden standard, right? Because they have comprehensive like automatic expungement legislation that passed, right? It's in the books. It's a law. But that doesn't mean that it's happening. Like right now, like passing the law is just step one. Getting the law right is step one. And we need that language in order to hold governments accountable. But even still, like we have to we can improve upon policies like in California by implementing accountability mechanisms. Because right now what we've got in California is that they've got all this automatic expungement language, et cetera, but there's still people who either counties that aren't fulfilling their obligations under the law because they say we don't have the money to do it, and the state didn't mandate it. So which means the state didn't provide funding for it. So the counties can there's a loophole there, right? They're like, well, we don't have the money to do to get the data capacity and whatnot to because it's like all of these things take money and effort, like to clear records.
It does, but how difficult, Mickey, is it to write to write in the legislation oversight and monitoring component?
See, that's not difficult.
That's not difficult. If they were at the table, someone should have been looking at the oversight and monitoring component to be put in the legislation, and the designation of who would do oversight and monitoring.
Facts. And I think that's why, I gotta give it to it sounds like it doesn't sound like I am being very critical of government and government stakeholders, etc. But but it's both and, right? Because at the same time, when I was doing systems work at Vera, it was a hard time, but I'll say I've worked with government stakeholders very closely, and there are also stakeholders that really want to figure out how to get it right, and they just don't know what they don't know.
They
And
don't
at
know
the
what they
same,
don't know.
they don't know what they don't know, and often they're not the people to know, right? The community is the one that knows. The people who have been impacted are the experts of their experience, and that's the only place we're going to find solutions. But again, like I've seen government stakeholders that want to do the right thing, but they've never engaged with the community before, so they don't know how, right? And so it's like both. Like I can empathize and understand, but also like it's about accountability at the end of the day. Like it's not about shaming or judging. It's about holding government accountable, because government is supposed to be like working on behalf of the people, right? And the government has done infinite amount of harm for a number of years, basically like the history of our country. And it's like with cannabis being legalized, with this era of like, all right, we got an opportunity to I mean, like a lot of people are talking about money, right? So it's opportunity to make a whole lot of money, but like that money can do some real healing. It's an opportunity to right some wrongs and to start a process of truth and reconciliation. But most places thus far, whenever people draft legalization policy, the criminal justice piece is an add-on. It's like, this is the cannabis reform, and here's the criminal justice piece. And I think I can speak for my team at LPP, but I'll speak for myself and say that's the wrong way to look at it. If you even think you're like, oh, I think we want to legalize cannabis, the first place you should start is the criminal justice aspect. Like that should be the core guiding lens and framework to drafting policy. Like the intention behind it should be, how does this policy heal Black and brown folks? Not how do we build an industry and then how do we make some of this heal Black and brown folks? We need to flip it completely on its head. And hopefully states will learn from how other folks haven't necessarily gotten it right. But I'll say, at least for me, I'm asking a lot more. I want to see a lot more of states. I want to see a lot more of industry. Like I think a lot of people are still having trouble letting go of old ways of viewing what policy and reform can and should look like. Like I think we can be bolder. I think we can put Black and brown folks and impacted communities at the forefront a lot more than we have. And I think that, I think we're seeing some good talk, but I'm ready to see. I haven't seen a real good walk yet.
So a couple of things. Okay, so going forward, there's got to be a way to start promoting amendments to some of these, if it hasn't passed already. So let's say they still at the table. They got to put that piece in there around oversight and monitoring and designating who's going to do that, and preferably not the government. You probably want an outside entity that has no ties to anyone, right? And they report back to the courts on the status of these expungements. Number two, you mentioned about people who are most impacted by this new market and not being able to have an entree into the market because of a past record. I'm thinking that there are maybe different ways to get involved in the industry if you are barred from direct contact with cannabis. Because I remembered seeing a news program about someone that opened up a training and education and training center here. They were not dispensing cannabis, but they were an education, like an intermediary. And then you also have the education and training component, and then you have the distribution of I think it's the licensing for that. So I'm thinking there are many different ways to get in the industry that may not involve, especially if you're barred. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I can speak to it a little bit, although I will say that it's not my expertise. Like I really come from, or like most of my focus is on the sort of the criminal justice element and re-entry elements. When it comes to the actual sort of industry licensing and sort of operating within the industry piece, my colleagues are far more expert than I am.
Because when I think of reparations, I'm thinking of ways that people can who were incarcerated for something that is now legal, that amends can be made in some financial way. And I mean, yes. So I will say and it does depend on what your state you're in, because there are some states where
they're like people who have cannabis offenses can legally work in the industry. They may not be able to get licenses. They might be barred from that, but they can still be employed. And that was actually an effort that we hoped to take on in California, like creating a pipeline from folks who have been incarcerated for cannabis offenses to being able to get jobs within the industry. And I'll say, like, even when it's legal, it's still very tough because companies are risk averse and the cannabis industry is hot right now. And so that kind of brings up a conversation around fair chance hiring efforts, which is, you know, the workplace and industries often do like DE&I efforts, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion stuff, which is often about race and gender and a number of other identities. But being system impacted, hiring folks with criminal records, targeted hiring, fair chance hiring practices, that's something that like a lot of companies don't know how to do. And when they're encountering and dealing with somebody with a criminal record, legal liability, legal everything flags go off, even though it's totally legal for them to hire this person. But you can see how like a risk averse industry who doesn't know how to empathize or engage with system impacted folks would shy away from hiring. So that's one barrier.
But I'm remembering something about bonding. See, those arguments that the companies come up with, okay, that's why they put in that bonding mechanism for them to bond, you know, where they can get bonded, individuals that they hire to protect their interests.
Oh yeah, I will say I'm not an expert on fair chance hiring regulations. Although there are organizations that like are expert in dealing with like legal compliance around like hiring practices and whatnot. But I'll say just like generally, if you have a criminal record, it's hard to get hired. Like even when you have like laws on the books that are meant to protect folks from such discrimination. As we can see, laws on the books is not enough, right? People like, unless there's actual like accountability mechanisms or ways to enforce these laws on behalf of impacted folks, which there often is not. Usually it's like far more like companies have a whole lot more power than individuals, and especially a whole lot more power than an individual with a criminal record. So it's like, even in states that are the most legally favorable for employment opportunities and like sort of lack and removal of barriers to employment for system impacted folks, we still have a hard time getting these folks hired. That being said, I wanted to speak to sort of the other piece of your what you were asking about, which is places where it's actually like illegal, right? Like you're legally barred from participating in the industry. There are loopholes, like, and when I say loopholes, I'm talking about ancillary markets or the ancillary industry, tangential industries. So, you know, cannabis companies need a whole number of like technology and like, you know, actual physical structures. There's a whole bunch of things that it takes to run any business. And that's true also for the cannabis business. And so you have all these sort of ancillary industries popping up that have nothing to do with plant touching. It could be the tech side. We have an interesting opportunity for our constituents that arose that deals with the sales side of things, like cannabis companies outsourcing sales so that anyway, so it's like there's a lot of innovative ways to create space for impacted individuals, even if you're in a not so legally favorable state as it relates to employment for folks with criminal records. But again, that takes like community, that takes will, like somebody with power, it takes somebody with power to have the will, or it takes collective willpower coming together to create pressure on those who have power to do something about it. But it doesn't just happen. I'll tell you that status quo will continue as long as it's allowed to continue. Like there has to be pressure. And I'll say that very often that pressure is not going to come from within. Like every now and then we have champions either within the system or champions within an industry, within the private sector, that kind of take up the cause and want to champion on behalf of those who are impacted. But that's a rarity. Like by and large, what it takes is the community deciding that like we have power in numbers and we can leverage each other's strengths. Like I do that, me and my community, like, you know, we got a real estate agent over here, we got like a lawyer over here, whatever, like you come together and figure out how do we make more of ourselves together to overcome like the systems of a game that we weren't meant to win, right? Like, I mean, it's slow. Government and laws are slow to change because one, it's slow to change the law. Then it's slow to enforce the law. And then it's slow to get people to be held accountable when they don't like follow the law. And I'm not saying like all these things need to be in place because they're an anchor for us as the community to say, this is the law and these are our rights. So we need that there, but it's not enough. Like community has a lot of power. Like we talk about how county DAs, like the DAs are who decide to prosecute, right? They're local elected officials. Who else? The police, they are city and county, or like law enforcement, city and county agency. Local taxpayers pay for their police. We pay, I'm in Brooklyn right now, we pay $11 million plus for NYPD to do a whole lot of things that doesn't really keep us safe, right? So, but what I'm saying is like, these are local decision makers and they're the folks that we actually have the most access to. Like people think about the president and even senators and whatnot as like where we look to for power and decision making. But to be real, everything like flows upwards. Like you can create like, yeah, especially as it relates to mass incarceration, like there's a whole lot of power here at the bottom. And there's a whole lot of opportunity for change because most of these local decision makers are not like it's literally choices being made. Like they're not beholden to any like statutory stuff. Like DAs decide who to prosecute. Police decide who to arrest or who to approach or who to take to the ER or who to take to jail. Magistrate judges decide who gets pretrial detention with a high bail versus a low bail versus no bail. And you can see how it's like all of these folks who we at the county city level as just local civilians have access to are making immensely important decisions that impact sort of the larger picture as it relates to mass incarceration and other big social issues. And so anyway, yeah, we got to make them move. You know, they'll move if we make them.
Right. Okay. So there's some things that can be done at the policy level, even for those states who have already passed these laws. I'm just, because see, that loophole is bothering me.
Which one?
The one around, you know, the expungement piece and them not putting in the automatic. Yes. And sometimes you have to wonder, was that purposeful? Because, you know,
sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's okay. Some things, you know, I may be giving them a little bit more credit, but some things you would think folks in the policy arena would know to do to cover the bases. Because more often than not, a lot of the issues around the follow-up and ensuring things happen legislatively that turns into direct action have to do with not having anybody monitoring and overseeing what they say they're going to do in the legislation. That's not rocket science. Yeah.
I mean, I agree, which is like, how do I say this? I mean, not to sound, you know, I'm gonna just keep it real. Like, I'm not even gonna try and filter myself because, like, part of why I left doing systems work is because I realized ultimately, it's not that hard. It's not rocket science. A lot of the solutions are very, very clear. And at the end of the day, it's like people don't want to. That's it. Like, really, it's like people don't want to. And it's like, it's not that, I'll say this, it's not that they don't want to because, like, I don't believe in bad people. Like, I'm 100% like, I believe like humans are inherently good. And it's like, we are all victims of our conditioning in one way or another. And some of us, though, are more victims of circumstances and, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, the burdens fall disparately, but I don't believe anybody's born bad. That being said, it doesn't change the fact that it's like, it's a lack of human empathy. It's a lack of human compassion. It's a lack of being able to see outside yourself. A lot of people, it's like the reasons I see stakeholders not wanting to change is they're scared. Like, they're scared. It's all human emotions, like scared of, for example, a magistrate judge. There's somebody, like, we know research shows why detaining somebody pre-trial, like why the whole bail, the way we do bail and everything, why it's so problematic. There's a whole body of literature on that. And still, magistrate judges do a whole bunch of things to hold people pre-trial. Ultimately, those decisions I've seen, judges do it because they're scared that, like, what if I let this one person out and they do something? It's totally irrational. And as humans, we are terrible with, like, evaluating possibilities and percentages and probabilities. And, like, magistrates are judges, DAs are judges. Each of these individuals are, like, thinking here. They're thinking about me. instead of seeing the bigger picture of like
Right.
what this means, what your choice means for individuals and communities, and like the negative consequences it has. And ultimately, it's like also a lack of understanding of data. Like, we are still, the stories that we were told and the lies we were told from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, law and order, criminalization, war on drugs, like those stories are still heavily and deeply lodged in our, not just in some individual psyche, but in like community psyche. And the law is old and slow inherently. So think about how deeply entrenched that is, like not just in practices and policies, but in our education, like how we even teach lawyers to be lawyers. Like, there's a lot of deep stuff to unroot. So I understand, like, people are people, but that's why I came back out to the advocacy side, because while we need people continually pushing from the inside, pushing stakeholders from the inside, looking to government to do and to change, ultimately things will not change unless the community makes it happen. And that's why I'm on the advocacy nonprofit side, and not in government or in systems reform anymore. And I do believe there's place for collaboration, but again, like it's beyond individuals. We're talking about systems and institutions. So as much as you have people that want to change, like there are so many. Like, yeah, it's like the entire law, like the entire body of law and the way that we do the law is literally rooted in racism. So, you know, Audre Lorde, like master's tools, master's house, like, you know, the master's tools the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house type ideology or framework. Like, there's something to that, in that there are limitations to the way, like, if the law is our tool that we have been given to create positive change for ourselves, but the law was designed as a tool of oppression for Black and brown folks, it cannot be the only place we look to for change. You know what I'm saying? Like, it takes community organizing. It takes, like, you know, we got to be healthy as a community. We got to be able to eat as a community. We got to be able to, like, you know, mental health, dealing with trauma. Like, there's all these things that are also necessary for, like, us to be able to, like, thrive as a community that goes beyond, like, changing legislation and laws. But we need to do what we can with the tools and the opportunities that we have there is what I'm saying. Like, but I don't know, cannabis, it's been interesting. Like, I think cannabis is going to be is going to facilitate a lot of really interesting advocacy efforts that go beyond sort of traditional ways of doing things. Like, I was talking to somebody in Boston who, you know, because I stay pretty connected out there, since that's where I did my, like, you know, sort of street work stuff. And, you know, one of my people out there was talking about, like, yo, imagine, like, cannabis has all these healing properties. We know what it can do for trauma. We know what it can do for, like, folks with substance use disorder, this, that, and the third. Like, imagine, like, if there was transitional housing, right? People that come in and out from prison and jail, whatever. And we have a transitional housing where it's like they're learning to work with the plant, they're learning the medicinal benefits of it, and they're like being so, like, cannabis can be so many things. It can be a site of healing, it can be a tool for healing, and it can be an opportunity for employment, economic opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. There's so much we can do here with legalization and innovative, like, thinking about investing in healing community in innovative ways. But in order to try all of these things and be curious about all of these things, the laws, we have to get rid of all these legal barriers, and specifically the criminalizing ones. Because if you can be, like, as long as cannabis, the word cannabis remains in the criminal legal realm, as long as it's something that you can lose your kids over, you can lose your job over, you can lose, like, whatever over, you know, it's not accessible for Black and brown folks. As long as that's there, like, it's not a meaningful opportunity for Black and brown folks, as long as those criminalizing laws, punishing laws are on the books. So we got to think, like, we got to think deep in terms of when we're drafting policy. Because, again, like, we talked about the issues of supervised release, right? Like, it could be legal, and police could even say, like, they can say, like, you can't arrest, but if it's a violation of probation, that still gives you that still gives the system a way to for you to get, like, pulled back in. If DCF, if, like, custody battles, right? Like, think about that. Like, should a mom or whoever be able to be, like, lose their kids over a possession offense, right? Like, they might not be locked up in jail, for it, but are they losing their job, their housing, or their kids over it? Like we're still punishing in all these
Exactly.
ways for a plant that we have decided is good and worthy of like being an essential business during a pandemic. Like that makes no sense to me.
Right.
So it's like we gotta think big in terms of
Yeah.
undoing, because like the war on drugs was a big war in the making, right? Like a lot went into making this problem. So undoing it is also going to take a lot, and it's
A
going to
lot.
take more than the minds that are often in the room. You know?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. Mickey, we've reached our 10:45 mark for Q&A. I want to check in with Melissa and Rachel. And who else is monitoring?
I think it's just Rachel and I.
Okay.
Rachel, do you want to go first? I think you probably have more questions than I do.
Yeah, there's just been a lot of comments. So I saw one, and I think there's another.
You have more questions?
I'll have to find it. But the first one is, can you look into the Bastian law? The jurors are only 3 Blacks. The jury is set for us to be guilty, and they're not in our areas or counties. I don't know if you know what that is.
I would need. I mean, the law off bat, I don't know, but also I would have a number of questions of like, are we talking federal, state, local, like what level? Like I would need more context, and probably wouldn't be able to answer that on the podcast. But
what was the name of that law?
The Bastian, Bastion.
I mean, I could look it up real quick. I mean, speaking legalese is one of the main reasons I went to law school.
You said Bastin law. Sorry.
Oh, Bastin.
Bastin law. Okay. Let's take a look.
Bastin.
I'm not seeing, nothing's popping up for me, so I'm not sure if it might be a local or state specific law, perhaps.
Can you respond back to the person and ask?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's responding as we're talking. She's just saying Bastin law, Google, the law is federal. The jurors are not out cohort. I don't know what that means. Not sure.
Oh, USV Bastin? Is that are they talking about case law? Perhaps?
Probably a case law.
Yeah, that must be what it is.
That's probably a name.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I'm not gonna read the case law right now. But what I can do is, if they're curious, I can take a look at it later and perhaps give a thought. But if they can like be more specific with their question and how it relates to the case they're referring to, I could maybe provide some high level analysis.
I have another. The next question could be, should individuals in drug court programs be allowed to use cannabis?
Ooh, so it's a very big question, because drug courts are a conversation to have in and of themselves. For listeners, I'll briefly describe what a drug court is. So a drug court is like, let's say somebody has been arrested on a drug offense, they're being held in jail. Very often, like we've got these things called like diversion programs, or there'll be specialty courts, which are considered off ramps from where a typical criminal case would proceed through the legal system. Because normally it's like arrest, case proceedings, and then very often a guilty plea, because most things don't go to trial, and then a sentence to either to whatever. It could be community supervision, probation, or prison. A drug court is a situation where either the DAs or the courts, any number of stakeholders, can create a program to say, okay, instead of doing it the traditional way, you can, sometimes they'll say you have to plead guilty, sometimes they'll say you don't have to plead guilty, depending on where they put the diversion program. But you've been arrested, and instead they'll say, we're going to put you in the specialty court. And usually the specialty court is like, there will be a judge or whoever, and usually there's a program that the defendant or the individual has to complete in order to either avoid prison time or avoid being sentenced, period. Like there's different ways you can do it, but it's like an alternative. a number of these drug courts can be really great in that they create an alternative to incarceration. But there's a number of problems with how they've been done, because one, very often people who end up in drug courts are people that don't need to be in drug courts. So it's like, because drug courts, the idea of drug courts are meant to be an alternative for, it's like somebody who has a substance use disorder and has committed a criminal offense because the behavior of addiction has been criminalized. So we're trying to give them an opportunity to like kind of get their stuff together, get their treatment and whatever, and avoid incarceration.
Right.
As it relates to cannabis, most people who are in on cannabis offenses are not good candidates for drug courts because they don't have a substance use disorder very often. I mean, unless it's a case where there's a substance use disorder and the cannabis is also something they indulge in as part of a larger addiction. But if cannabis is like cannabis possession or cannabis like only related offenses, often there's no substance use disorder there like present. And so what you have is like a misinformed view of cannabis use and cannabis as a plant. And you end up having people like without substance use disorders in these courts that are designed for people with substance use disorders. So imagine if you don't have a drug problem, but in order to avoid incarceration, you have to, go to NA, you have to be drug tested X amount times per week, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'll say is like, they can be a good tool and they can be a good alternative, but by and large, like, the way that they're designed is not based on data. They're not evidence-based or data driven. That's one big issue. Another big issue we have is even when drug courts are done well, often because of like, there's often a bunch of like rules as to who gets to access this alternative. So they'll say, okay, like we have this alternative. There's a way you can avoid being incarcerated, but you have to have no prior offenses. You have to be like this, you have to be that. And they have all these rules that often exclude the people who need it the most. And very often it disparately lands on Black and brown folks. Another problem we see, and I'm just saying, like, I'm pointing it out because for anybody who's listening who has a potential opportunity to like set up a drug court in their locality, because it all operates at the county level, they're really great when done right and really can make things really worse when done wrong. I'll say one other issue. So we talked about like excluding people who need it, often Black and brown. We talked about misapplication of the alternative, right? Misapplication of utilizing drug courts in regards to who needs it and who doesn't. One other thing that's worth looking at is who is successful in these programs, because what often happens is that, and this is why a lot of folks will opt out of taking the alternative. They'll say, give me the prison time instead. And this is like guys that I worked with on the streets, like they would say that, they'd be like, no, I'm not going to take that program, because sometimes you'll end up being like the punishment you would receive for not being successful in the program is worse than what you would have if you had just taken the traditional approach. So it's like some folks will say, no, I'm not going to do this drug court program that gives me the opportunity to avoid all incarceration, because the conditions they put on me are so burdensome that there's very slim chance that I would succeed. And if you don't succeed, sometimes you are punished more than you would be if you just took a regular guilty plea. So it's like, again, we've seen a lot of criminal justice reforms and a lot of like progress in our ways of thinking about how we do things in the criminal justice system. But they need to be data driven and evidence based. Like we need to take a scientific approach as to not just science. I mean, scientific in the broadest sense, in that human stories and anecdotes and lived experience are just as quality and valuable of data as quantitative data, which like we need to value both of these things. Right. But we can't look to like how we've done things to inform how we do things going forward, because how we've done things is how we've gotten here. So we need to think outside the box, and very often that means bringing disciplines and minds outside of the law to help us figure out problems with the law. Okay.
Thank you, Mickey.
Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to the drug court question, but it's one that like I spent a lot of time doing research on that. So I'm like, great, but please, it's not like it's not a silver bullet, like in and of itself.
Any other questions?
Really, there aren't any more questions. There's one of our participants who's responding quite a bit and interacting, Victoria Blake. Just, I think what it comes down to is one of her last comments was just that she said, "I'm trying, but as a victim of racism in the criminal justice system, it's so hard to forgive what they put me through. Prison is better because the program is set up for failure." And then she also said, "When I was in college, our only option for community service was the food banks or churches. When I went to jail, I noticed how white students were doing their community services at the jail and studying us. It is what it is. We know what to do. The 13th Amendment says we're not fully human. That's why they get away with the things they do." So I don't know if you would like to just speak to that general.
I'm sorry, go back.
Yeah.
Go back. Did you say
that
the white students got to do what?
Yeah. So
they
her
got to do their community service because they were using, they got some kind of charge for possession, right? So they got to do service at the jail.
Well,
I want to make sure I'm understanding this, so I can.
Yeah. No problem.
To help.
Yeah. I don't know all the details, but here's the verbatim comment is this. When I was in college, our only option for community service was the food banks or churches.
Okay.
When I went to jail, I noticed how white students were doing their community services at the jail, studying us.
So not necessarily community service as a sentence. I think they're just talking about like generally, like for white folks, like jail is not a site of trauma. That's not actually true. For depending on where you are, like especially rural areas, white folks are affected as well by mass incarceration in major ways. But I think what you're saying is like disparately, like it's Black and brown folks that are in the jails, and it's a place for white folks to go and do community service as opposed to, like something really terrible.
Well,
does that make sense?
I really wish the commenter could be a little bit more clear about that, because I'm really curious about that. In terms of were these students, had they gone through court for something and they ended up being able to get preferential placements for their community service is what I want to understand.
She's saying exactly.
Oh, that is what it was? Yo, that's real crazy.
And what probably happened is they knew somebody or a professor recommended and said, okay, maybe you can do this in exchange for this particular project in the class. You got to do something here. That's what I thought she meant.
Yeah, I was hoping it wasn't that, but I was like, no, that's true. I was like, that could be a thing, but yeah, I don't really think there's much to say. There's not a whole lot to say to that other than like that resonates. It resonates in that, I don't know, this has been my career, like since graduating law school. It's just been about like trying to figure out how to heal, how to like, not to like heal, like I'm a savior of any sort, like I'm going to do it. But like, I've been curious. I just like want to understand how can we possibly like change things? How can we push in the right direction? And I'll say I have felt a lot of hopelessness a lot of the time, for a number of reasons. And it's like, but I've also like, I think the longer I'm in it and sort of like the more I've gone through just the trauma of it all, like, I'll say to fully step into the space, like, I've lost people to gun violence. I've lost people to jail, to prison, to substance use disorder overdose. I've talked to people, like when I was doing research in jails, the stories, the number of interviews I did, and the stories of just like, just like what the hard truth and reality of the society and the world that we live in, and the systems and the culture that we've inherited, right? Because it's an inheritance. Like Black and brown folks, we inherited this world on our end, and white folks inherited the world on their end. You know what I'm saying? It's like, but we all have the responsibility, like, of what we want to do with what we inherited. And I'll say that I don't know. Like, I think the thing that like gives me hope is, for me, Black and brown people give me hope, because the joy, like I'll say, like when I was doing ICW, really set me up for like the long haul in this work, because those, like, and I can't talk, obviously I'm still working through this shit in therapy, so I'm like, I don't want to get too emotional on the podcast, but it's like, while it was like I was working with people that had literally nothing, like nothing, and everything was set up against them, like their community is like, you're constantly looking over your shoulder because you're worried about getting shot or this or that. But sorry, I'm gonna take a second. But it's the most love I have ever seen in my life. Like I learned how to love from that world, and that's something. Like, we would have guys that, like, they just made their first $20 training somebody, and that 18-year-old boy who a judge said, he's a menace to society, he'll take that $20, give $5 to his brother over here, $5 to his mom's, $5 to his whoever, and then he'll keep $5 for himself to like get himself a sandwich or something. And these guys don't have food, they don't know where they sleep and whatever. But I've never seen people more generous or loving or whatever. And at the same time, the entire world, the media, the judges, the police officers, the probation officers, everybody in society is saying, like, this is a bad person who doesn't deserve life, liberty, or happiness. These are some of these kids, they were boys, 16 years old. Anyway, I'm just saying, like, what gives me hope is that the folks who have nothing, like, I would just be like, yo, how are you? I have immensely more than they do. And they'd be worried about me, asking me about, like, I've never felt more seen or loved than I have been in those spaces. And it's like, that's something. Like, we are special. We are, the fact that we're here and we're happy and we're making it, like, that's something. So I have faith in community. Like, I have faith in the people. I don't have much faith in government, but I have faith in people.
And people.
Right.
That's where the answer lies. That's where the answer lies, Mickey. The answer lies in us. We keep looking externally and outward and having expectations of government and believing in government and believing.
Right.
Please, no, it is us. As you were talking, even from the top of the show, and even what you just concluded with, I keep thinking about the loss yesterday of DMX.
Bro, yeah, man, you're gonna get me crying over again.
And when you read, well, I have to end on this note, because that would have been my era. He's 50, I'll be 56 this month, okay? But I wasn't a rap head, right? I wasn't into a lot of that music. I liked a lot of other stuff, but I knew of him. But when I learned his story, see, many people are not asking what happened. They just look and say, oh, he's one of them thug rappers, or he's got this in a video and this and that. He came from the streets, but see, what people don't understand with him, which resonates with so many of the people who are caught up in this marijuana mess, his first traumatic experience was at the hands of his mother and his mother's boyfriends. And then she said she was going to take him to go visit this little group home, and left him there at 6 years old and never came back for him. So see, our early introductions and experiences, many of the people sitting on the outside judging and saying, oh, that's that community over there, or that's what they do over there. They never stop and ask, what happened? Babies don't come here. They come here as a blank slate.
Mm-hmm.
But we want to condemn and demonize adults who are basically walking around in an adult shell with a very traumatized and wounded child on the inside. We have to stop doing that to each other and start asking the right questions. I'm sorry, there was no way. This whole show, I've been sitting here thinking all of this and just really looking at the fact that this person was also a very tormented individual. So what I'm saying is, how many of the individuals that people are coming into contact with in these courts who are calling them menaces to society, never inquiring about their backgrounds and exposures to things that they should have never been exposed to. We also have to call these courts on the carpet when these people come before these judges. Why are you not doing social histories? Most of them don't do social histories. They should. They cost. You got to get somebody that's an expert in doing them, but they should be mandatory. So you can get down to the root cause and apply the appropriate sentence for them, not just jail time or prison time. Anyway, I could go on and on this, because when you talk about many people looking to government for the answers, you all, the answers lie within inside of us. And we have to stop being afraid and saying, oh, that's not my problem, or that's not my business, oh, that's not my relative, oh, there's nothing for me to. Yes, there is. And many of us will probably be very, very surprised if one day you find out that you had a purpose and a call on your life and a reason for being here, and you missed it because you were judging. Okay. Anyway, on that note, we're like at 10:05. Mickey, look here. I enjoyed you, your knowledge, your direct involvement, your insight and discernment of understanding what's problematic with systems and transitioning into a place where you could be more effective, and recognizing that it is us. Community matters, you all. We have to stop living so isolated.
Thank you so much.
I don't expect everybody to do it. You know, I may be Pollyannish at some level, okay? But I still believe we have what we need on the inside of us. We have to stop being afraid to be different and to come outside of our little comfort zones where we acting like everybody else and everybody's approving of how we doing. Do something different. Be different. Stand out. Thank you, Mickey. Thank you, production team. Thank you, Justice Beat family and our family on Real STL News for joining us. We'll be back with you next Saturday. And God bless.
Thanks for having me,
Thank you
guys.
for listening to the Justice Beat.
Great.
If you like what you heard and found the information useful, then support the Justice Beat Talk Show by spreading the word and telling a friend.